Today, we're going to pick up where we left off last week, exploring the origin of the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And we're going to be joined by two authors of a fascinating article published in Independent Science News, if we can put that up there. And so this is Jonathan Latham. He's the editor of Independent Science News, and he's executive director of the Bioscience Resource Project. The article was co-authored by Sam Husseini, who is a journalist on Substack and elsewhere, and was the co-author of this story. Happy to welcome them both to Counterpoints today. Sam, Dr. Latham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start out, as we did last week, by playing a clip from a podcast that included virologist Christian Anderson attempting to kind of debunk a conspiracy theory, but in the process making a fascinating admission, if we could roll that.
The problem is that people see these coincidences. One of the new ones is the Ebola lab leak, which also is being blamed on us because we have been studying Ebola in Kenema in Sierra Leone, and lo and behold, Ebola emerged just a few miles from there in 2014, right? Obviously across the border in Guinea, but it's maybe 100 miles or so away. And people then put that together and say, oh, so that Ebola must have been a lab leak too. And it was Robert Gary and Christian Anderson again. And the reason why these names keep coming up and the reason why we get grant money to study infectious diseases is because we study infectious diseases and have done so for many, many decades. And that's why the names keep coming up again, right? It's not because there's some major conspiracy theory here where all of us have been sort of fiddling with the fields well prior to the pandemic.
And so, Sam, the mainstream media's initial story of the outbreak of Ebola was that in Guinea, a 2-year-old child was playing with bats. And then several months later, you wound up with an Ebola outbreak. What to you was so important from that interview that Dr. Anderson gave?
Well, my suspicions predated his recent statements, obviously, but it's remarkable that he would be saying this at this point. They have been denying that they were working on Ebola this entire time. In their prior statements, Gary wrote an article, his co-partner as head of the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. These are the labs in West Africa that Africans claimed might have been the source of the 2014 Ebola outbreak. He recently denied it in an article. So for Anderson now to be seeming to admit in a very interesting and curious way that they were in fact working on Ebola is, I think, potentially an incredibly significant development. But the case against their narrative that it, effectively pinning this on he wasn't even 2 years old, he was 18 months old. This was over 1,000 miles away from prior Ebola outbreaks. In prior Ebola outbreaks, there was always a die-off of the local mammalian species. There was no such die-off of local mammalian species. They even acknowledged that. Fabian Linders, who wrote the sort of what we would call the cover story, and who was also part of the Wuhan Institute of Virology investigation by the World Health Organization. They acknowledged in their article that there were no bats that they could find in the village that they claim where the outbreak started, and they also acknowledged that there was no die-off of the mammalian species. So there are an incredible number of holes in their dominant narrative. And the closer you look at this, the more it points to a concerted effort to effectively frame Guinea. That is, this happened in 3 countries, and there's a whole series of patterns in which they seem to have tried to pin this on Guinea just over the border from Sierra Leone to get it away from where the U.S. labs were.
Right, and Dr. Latham, I want to bring you in here. What does the evidence, as far as we know, say about where the most likely origin was?
Well, I mean, the balance of evidence, I would say, favors Guinea, but there are some open questions about the provenance of some of the samples that were taken. So, for example, during the outbreak, at the very beginning, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, alleged that they were the people who identified the very first confirmed cases. But what they argued was that those confirmed cases were in fact coming from across the border in Sierra Leone. And if you look at the phylogenetic research that has been used to pin the outbreak on Guinea, what you see is that some of the very earliest cases that are pinned on Guinea are probably actually from an outbreak in Sierra Leone. And so if you undo that misattribution, as it were, then what you come up with is almost certainly an origin in Sierra Leone.
And did it start earlier than has been publicly claimed, the epidemic, that is, or do we have evidence of that at this point?
Well, the official start of the outbreak is the first diagnosed cases on March the 17th. But what the people in Sierra Leone identified was a start on May 25th. So this is 2 months later, and but what they found when they first started identifying cases is that these cases were many mutations different from each other, which implies that there had been an outbreak in Sierra Leone long before. But we don't know if there was an outbreak in Guinea long before. That is the allegation of Fabian Leendertz and the paper that essentially found nothing in Guinea when they went to look at the purported outbreak site. So the claim of Leendertz is that the outbreak started in December with the death of this young child. But there is essentially no evidence for that. So the child doesn't have a confirmed diagnosis. None of his contacts has a confirmed diagnosis. There's no confirmed diagnosis for almost 3 months after that. So for the scientific community to allege that is the first date of the outbreak is frankly ridiculous.
What else, Sam, what else could that child have died of? Like they say it was Ebola. What else could it have been?
His father thinks that he died of malaria, and his father didn't get anything. The healthcare workers in the village didn't get anything. His mother did also die, but that was apparently potentially for treatment that she got from Ebola. She was pregnant at the time, so she was in a particularly vulnerable state. I don't know if Jonathan could have more ideas on that.
There are some suggestions that she might have had cholera too, but at the time there was no suggestion that she had Ebola virus. And obviously, people who have miscarriages, viral hemorrhagic fevers are diseases associated with loss of blood. But obviously, so are miscarriages. And so she died along with her child. And so there's no real reason to think, so far as I can see, that she had Ebola, because it can be misdiagnosed so easily. I mean, basically, the only way that anybody considers that you can confidently diagnose Ebola is with a lab test. And no lab tests were done until the middle of March.
And why, Sam, what do we know about this lab that was in Sierra Leone? And why would there be this 2-month period in which it seems as if Ebola is circulating, but it's not getting picked up?
I'll let Jonathan speak to the second point, but this lab is headed by Robert Garrity and Christian Anderson. Those names might ring a bell with people because they are the authors, the two primary authors of the Proximal Origins paper, which came out in the spring of 2020 and asserted that COVID could not be a laboratory construct. It's very difficult to overstate the importance of this article. It really set the tone for the dominant mainstream media coverage of COVID, that it couldn't possibly come out of a lab, and you were a nut job to think that it could possibly come out of a lab. So they had a massive conflict of interest to dismiss the possibility of lab origin, because the next question would be, if the global public, imagine if the global public understood in early 2020 that this plague ravaging through the world could have come out of a lab, one of the next major questions would have been, what about prior outbreaks? And as a matter of fact, I asked in February of 2020, the CDC, if COVID could have come out of a lab. And their response was disingenuous. And then when I followed up and I pushed, they said, well, we got to be careful about what kind of information we put out here, because remember what happened with the Ebola in 2014, and we had to dismiss the possibility of a lab origin then in order to have people deal with the disease, which was a very weird way to put it. That's a major thing that we have to keep in mind. There are all kinds of U.S. institutions that are involved with this Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium, and the work done there was increasingly done on dangerous viruses, particularly after, people might remember, the anthrax attacks of 2002. Chernobyl emphasizes this, Sierra Leonean journalists, that there was a spike in that activity and massive funding for work on dangerous viruses and pathogens during that period. So we know that it was working on deadly pathogens, and we know that they had safety issues. There were statements by some of the scientists there saying, well, we can get so much work done here than we could in the United States because the safety concerns are not as onerous from their point of view. They don't have to be in a BSL-4 lab and be in a spacesuit kind of thing. So from their point of view, it's so much easier to do this kind of dangerous lab work.
Not cost-free. Yeah, Jonathan, to that second point, how would you have a 2-month outbreak in Sierra Leone that doesn't get picked up? And what was MSF's response to that?
Well, the simple answer to the first part is that at the beginning of an outbreak, there are not very many cases typically. So an Ebola doesn't transmit that easily. So it would be possible to miss it in between that and the problems with diagnosing Ebola, which, especially in its early stages, looks like many other illnesses, like we've heard about malaria and cholera. But this is an area of West Africa that is in which Lassa fever is endemic. So that's another disease that can be misattributed in this case. So you have all these possible confusions, and what MSF discovered when they went to the lab, and also the World Health Organization. So a series of organizations went to the lab after the outbreak started. This is the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium lab in Kenema in Sierra Leone. And they went there and they discovered all kinds of biosecurity breaches. There were allegations of needles all over the floor, that they didn't have UV decontamination procedures in place, and that samples were reagents were being reused and so forth. And we know that there was confusions. There was a group, there's a company called Metabiota, and there's a Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium that were basically operating the same premises, but essentially ended up in conflict with each other. And this conflict seems to have started in confusion. But there's also the possibility that, exactly like COVID, that there is a great benefit to anybody who leaks a lab to confuse the data around the origins, because then it becomes impossible to reestablish what actually were the chains of the contact chains and the dates of diagnoses and so forth of the people who first get the illness.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.